Welcome to the Capitalist Corner. I'm Michael Liebowitz, also host of the Rational Egoist and vice chair of the American Capitalist Party. I'm an all-around swell guy, but we have an absolutely amazing guy. Back with us today is prosecutor, author, and philosopher extraordinaire. And on our thumbnail, he's actually depicted as God, Jim Valliant. Welcome back.
That's appropriate. I think you found the right
Get the right combo,
the closest analog to me is, of course, God.
And on the thumbnail, it said, I cast constitutional awareness. So we do have a question here, though, first that we'll get to. And the question is Jim working on any new books? And I will let Jim answer for himself. Go ahead, Jim. You can tell him all about it.
Yes, I have a couple of projects that I have in mind. I've been working for some time, and the glacial pace at which I write books on a wider treatment of religion. On the Rational Egoist podcast, I discussed symbols and rituals with you. That was actually just a taste of the wider treatment of world religion that I'm working on after my first book. There it is, Creating Christ. So that's high up on the agenda. I'm teaching a course in constitutional law that I hope will be reduced to a book. I think a book unlike any that has ever been written on the subject of constitutional law. But what the heck, I'm a nut, and of course, I'm considering writing a memoir of people have been begging me to do so. So I've got at least 3 books, 2 of them, let's put it this way, are kind of on the back burner. But I try and devote some time, sometime each week to the wider book on religion I'm writing.
All right, now to the good stuff. The Supreme Court is hearing a case on Trump's executive order concerning birthright citizenship. It doesn't seem, though, that they're actually going to address the constitutionality of the birthright citizenship stuff. What they're actually aiming at is whether these injunctions by lower courts that go nationwide are constitutional. It seems like they might be just trying to not have to address the big issue. I don't know. I'm not the. I was going to say I haven't actually argued a case in court, but I have. But I haven't argued as many as you. So what's your take on this? What's going on? What's your prediction?
Well, I just happened to have watched, listened to the C-SPAN coverage of the argument.
Riveting.
Yeah, riveting stuff. And it's very interesting because many of the Supreme Court justices, I think, are not big fans of these giant and nationwide injunctions. It is, of course, the Congress of the United States that should step up to the plate, in my view, and define the jurisdiction and the potential remedies that district courts, because they're created by Congress. District courts aren't mentioned in the Constitution. And in fact, the Constitution under Article 3 says that they can define the jurisdiction of these congressionally created courts. And so but the Supreme Court has an independent role, it seems to me, and many of the justices yesterday expressed an awareness of their independent role in this. Nationwide injunctions really, in the sense that we're talking about, are a creature of since the 1960s, and they have been increasing in number. That is to say, they've exploded. Where government, if you're a party to the case, stop doing what you're doing. And one district court in one area, and they do forum shop. This is the argument against it. They do forum shop, lays out this injunction, and until it works its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, we live under a national injunction. Now, there are middle-of-the-road ways the Supreme Court can deal with this. For example, certify a class of people who are affected by it.
To try to, you just froze, Jim, and I realized that I forgot to plug into the internet. So you continue talking about this. I'll plug in and I'll be back with my questions in a minute.
Okay.
The height of professionalism over here.
Well, the truth is that it would be, I think, rather than having a piecemeal approach of district court to district, or one district court will agree with Trump and not issue the injunction. Another district court may disagree. And so what needs to happen is we need to get the same issue before the same court. And the way to do that is by certifying a class in a kind of class action. People have heard of that, class action. That way we don't have a checkerboard of different decisions that could be in conflict with one another. The Supreme Court was not very amenable to, I think, the government, the Trump administration's policy. So they don't want to go so far as to put the kibosh on it and limit district courts to little injunctions that only cover their particular case, because that would be absurd. It would require a bunch of separate district court cases. But as I say, I think there's a middle road, and I kind of predict that it will be about injunctions. They want the case, the term that was used yesterday, to percolate. That is to say, to ripen in the factual findings that are found at the trial court level before they get up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said, the court will attempt to avoid deciding the substance if there's some procedural matter that comes first. Is there standing? Do the parties have any standing to bring the case? Do we have proper jurisdiction? Has it properly been fleshed out at the lower court level so that we have a factual record upon which to decide the substance? So it is true the courts are aware of the fact that cases should really only decide the case or controversy that's before them. But when they invoke constitutional issues, they should flesh out the factual record and let it go up to the Supreme Court. As I say, Congress could fix that. They've been asleep at the wheel on all this for the last several decades. Don't expect any action from Congress. It would face a Senate filibuster from the Democrats anyway. So it's pretty much left in the court's hands to deal with the problem, and I'll put that in quotes, some people don't even regard it as a problem, of nationwide injunctions coming from a single district court judge. And as I say, I think maybe the best answer for that is to require that a class be certified so that we get the same issue decided by one court, flesh it out fully for everyone, and then let it go up to the Supreme Court. But if the Supreme Court can avoid deciding an issue of substance, they will avoid deciding an issue of substance and wait for it to percolate up to have a factual record properly developed in district court so that they can decide the matter of substance. Now, that's a lot of legal mumbo jumbo, but for a lot of viewers, I know. But I think that most judges are not going to rule in favor of Trump's position. I think it calls for some clarification of the law, but I don't think they're going to land on Trump's side on the merits of the case from the vibes I'm getting. I don't think they're going to say that the children of tourists or ambassadors get birthright citizenship because there's the subject to the jurisdiction thereof part of birthright citizenship. But I think they're going to be in favor of some birthright citizenship. There's no question. There's 20, whatever it is, 27-year-old case, almost 130-year-old case that says if parents have obtained residence in the country and their child is born here, they're citizens. They're citizens. And the Supreme Court decided that long ago. And I don't think they're going to change that too terribly much, although they might give a more complex, panned out answer on what does qualify as subject to jurisdiction thereof and what doesn't. I think it'll be a disappointment largely to Mr. Trump on birthright citizenship, but they will avoid that issue if at all possible. That is the normal course for the Supreme Court. If we don't have to decide the issue, let's not decide it right now. What is, I think, that was the main concern for all of these justices was the scope of Trump's argument about nationwide injunctions. Never, no, out, no way. These national injunctions cannot interfere with executive power. The Supremes were very skeptical of that. On the other hand, they're also concerned with the abuse of the injunctive power, injunctive relief, which has been just built in to court jurisdiction since the dawn of our country. So I think they may rein in at the margins. There are middle solutions, as I pointed out, just one. They'll rein in at the margins the injunctive power of district courts.
So, Jim, tell me if I'm wrong on any of this, right? Because I'm going to get to a question, but I want to make sure that I'm factually correct. I was taught when I took legal courses that the power of judicial review was granted to the Supreme Court in Marbury v. Madison. That's what I was taught. But
Yes.
Subsequently, now prior to Marbury v. Madison in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton argued that the Supreme Court had the power for judicial review.
Yeah.
And I later learned from Randy Barnett that when they say in the Constitution that the judicial power is vested in the Supreme Court, that it was understood that judicial review was part of that power. Nevertheless, the case Marbury-Madison comes before John Marshall in the Supreme Court, and it had to do with James Madison was supposed to deliver a commission to somebody, and he refused to do it. And instead of ruling on that issue, Marshall took the power for himself, and what he did was said, it's unconstitutional to command Madison to do this, and I can't uphold an unconstitutional law, therefore I can't make him do it. So my question is this: given that the judicial power is vested in the Supreme Court, but Congress is charged with the power to establish lower courts, which they've done. Now, I'm not a fan of the idea of all these little courts giving injunctions, all over the place. However, I'm also not a fan of executive orders violating the Constitution. So if you're a lower court and you get a case before you that clearly violates the Constitution, it just seems to me that if they're going to rule on an individual case only and say, well, this case violates the Constitution, you're going to have a nightmare that the Supreme Court's going to end up having to sort out anyway. So why don't they just sort that out now?
Right. And that's the sort of solution that I think the Supreme Court will come down on. Let's define the class of persons that would be affected by this and have one court decide it. You can have a court in California and a court in Texas. District courts come to very different decisions about the executive order, right? Based on the different plaintiffs and maybe even the different fact patterns of the case in front of them. And you could have a complex quilt pattern of different decisions from different district courts, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. So if it is a matter of national importance where there is a constitutional issue at play, they should define the class, make it a class action suit, and funnel all the cases affected by it through one district court and then have that appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. That would account for the need for fleshing out the factual issues in one district court and have that go up reasonably expeditiously up to the Supreme Court. Otherwise, it's a gigantic waste of government effort and time. The district court should have the power to provide injunctive relief. And when it involves a constitutional issue, say a constitutional issue that's going on across the country, let's funnel it into one court for one nice, clean decision on that. There are ways the Supreme Court they supervise the federal courts, and that is their power. But you're right. If you read my reading of the Constitution, clearly gives the power to the Supreme Court to resolve cases and controversies under the Constitution. The also gives the Congress the power to create all lesser courts, and it says that the courts in general, their jurisdiction can be defined by law. So the Congress, anytime it wanted to step up to the plate here and do its job, could, if the Republicans control it. Now, of course, as I say, it would have to overcome a Senate filibuster, and the Democrats are in no mood to do that. But what's so ironic is that when Joe Biden was president, or when Obama was president, you have Supreme Court justices on the left saying, these injunctions are interfering with presidential power. The left, and normally the leftist Supreme Court justices, are in favor of unwieldy executive power and limiting injunctions which restrict the executive's function. It was so funny because Sotomayor, who said that recently, apparently is totally on the other side now that it's Donald Trump's power and injunctive relief over him. So I agree with you. I don't expect the substance of the issue of birthright citizenship to be decided at this stage. I don't think the Supreme Court thinks that it's ripe That's the word they use, because we need to have the issue fleshed out in a factual way better by a district court. But hopefully one district court can do that, and it can expeditiously get to the Supreme Court. Republicans who don't like this, because of course this won't decide the issue of birthright citizenship off the bat and solve a whole bunch of problems for the Trump administration, we have to wait. Well, that's our constitutional system. If it invokes a constitutional issue, guess what? You're going to have to wait until the federal courts have decided. However inconvenient that might be for your executive policy.
Okay, I'm going to move on to freedom of speech. So, as everybody I'm sure knows, James Comey posted a photo of these seashells formed into the 8647. Now, let me just say that I don't think that Comey was calling for the death of the president. 86 does not mean to kill. It means to remove, to expel, things of that nature. Not only that, but the Republicans weren't so up in arms when Matt Gaetz was posting how he had 86th Kevin McCarthy and 86th Mitch McConnell. There wasn't all the, this drama. But nevertheless, we have a sitting Congresswoman, Lauren Boebert, and I'm sure there's others. That's just the one that I happen to see, that said Comey needs to go to jail for this. I say, even if he does mean kill the president, he's not ordering anybody to kill the president. He's not, making a legitimate threat toward the president. He's writing something in seashells. And I got to say, I think the First Amendment covers it. I certainly think that the natural right or the individual right to free speech covers it. But I'm curious, what do you think? What's going to come of this matter?
Well, there are very broadly written statutes about threatening the president or high government officials. There's, believe it or not, special laws, both on the federal and state level, that cover threats against the president that are distinct from normal, ordinary threats. And in the case of normal, ordinary threats, if I make a vague, unspecified threat like seashells, that would not count as, because of the First Amendment and your right to freedom of speech. If I wrote out and took a bunch of pebbles on the beach and said, overthrow the United States government, that would not be sufficient. We take a clear case on the one side. That would not be sufficient to give them the right to criminally prosecute the person. It would be a matter of free speech because it doesn't violate anyone's rights. It's not a specific, credible threat that calls for, it's imminent execution. And I think that your seashell case is much more like that. Now, as I say, there are specific laws about threatening the president in general. And those laws, I think, should be tested under the same First Amendment rubric that other threats are. And that's going to be where the question is. Can you generally threaten the president in such a way? Now, it has, even those, whatever, to the extent we have case law on that, it does say, well, it can't be a joke or it can't be a metaphor. It's got to be serious in its implication. And 86 is pretty vague and ambiguous. It can mean, Don Corleone, calls in, Luca Brasi and says 86, this guy. We all know that Don Corleone means bump him
because
off.
Of the context.
Because of the context.
Yeah.
But as you pointed out, many, many times we use the phrase 86 or deep six or something like that, means to kill the proposal, kill the idea, kill him politically. And so those are metaphorical, and they don't look like they're serious in their intent to execute it. And now people have said, well, look at the context. Let me try and be as fair as I can to the other side. Donald Trump was subject to assassination threats from Iran. There were two different people who tried to assassinate him. One, shot him and grazed his ear. They would say, in that context, an former FBI director who knows what 86, the context of 86 means, is threatening the president's life. Well, I don't think that's sufficient factually to show that Comey was threatening the president's life and comes within the meaning of the laws that protect the president against having threats against his life. But there are very generalized statutes, both on the states and federal level, that say you can't threaten public officials. If you're trying to intimidate him in terms of changing his policy. Now, that's a pretty vague idea, isn't it? But I think the intimidation has to be real, specific, credible. It can't just be, who's that comedian? She was an obnoxious a female comedian.
Oh,
She held the Trump head, disembodied head.
Elaine Boozer. Is that her
There you
name?
go.
Elaine
Thank
Boozer?
you.
Yeah.
I think that's it. And she held the bloody head, or Madonna during the first Trump administration. Yes, I have thought about blowing up the White House. Now, those were
No, Kathy Griffith. Kathy
Griffith.
Griffin was her
Kathy
name,
Griffith.
not Elaine. I don't even know who Elaine Boozer is, but Elaine, it was Kathy Griffin.
But now that you say Kathy Griffin,
Yeah.
it comes back to mind.
Great. She was on a great episode of Seinfeld.
Yeah. But let's remember the Madonna line, too, at her speech. Yes, I've thought about blowing up the White House. Was she prosecuted? No.
No.
Because no one takes Madonna seriously when she says something like that. James Comey was a former FBI director, but
So,
I don't
Jim,
take him any more seriously than I
when
do.
when you're prosecuting a case, right? Somebody comes before you. You have to have two broad elements: mens rea and actus reus. Mens rea is a guilty mind. There has to be the intent there. In actus reus, there has to be an act in furtherance of the crime. Given the ambiguity of 86, right, it's hard for me to imagine that anybody could actually say that there was the intent just to do that. And then actus reus, there was no act taken in furtherance of any attempt on Trump's life. And even if they were to try to push conspiracy, there's not two or more people and there's no action in furtherance of the conspiracy. I just don't like, to me, I think it was irresponsible of Comey to do this.
Yes.
But let's not say that it's just as irresponsible for sitting members of Congress to say Comey needs to go to jail for this.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. Sometimes just the threat in context is enough to do it. We've got an angry mob, and the angry mob is getting angrier and chanting, "We hate
Right.
Trump."
If it's the ABC Club from Les Mis, and they do something like this, oh God! But some guy on a beach.
Yeah. Now, as you said, it's perfectly disgusting that he should. What did he say? I came across this beautiful shell pattern or something.
Yeah.
I think that reveals something about his psychology. It's not a substantive criticism of Comey. We know where Comey's anti-Trump. Now, the real criticism to be delivered at Comey is that he was a partisan political hack as a government official. He was using the Justice Department, and here I have to agree with the Trump side to some extent. He used the Justice Department to protect Democrats and to go after Trump. No question. It was his BS that got the special prosecutor appointed for Trump, and it was, as it turns out, BS. On the other hand, he cleared Hillary Clinton, saying no reasonable prosecutor would prosecute her for her.
He also might have cost her the election, though.
It did.
I mean, let's be fair. I mean,
but that's the thing. You don't know what your effect is going to be. Just like the charging of Trump may have helped Trump win the election. All of those 30-some felonies he was convicted of didn't prevent the American people from doing it. But the point is, do we want our Justice Department to be free of politics? Absolutely. Yes. Is blind and equal justice required? So we don't have what they call this two-tiered justice system. James Comey is one of the most evil villains when it comes to politicizing our Justice Department and our justice system as FBI director. He was a partisan. He warped justice. He warped justice grossly in clearing Hillary Clinton. He absolutely was gunning for Donald Trump, regardless of the evidence, even if there was faked FISA warrant applications and so forth. The guy is up to his chin, it seems to me, in political prosecution, which turned a very dangerous corner, in my view, during the last bits of Obama and the first part of Trump's administration, and then through the Biden administration. There was grotesque politicization of the justice system, which I think is wrong. Comey did something very, very bad in that regard. However, this threat, the Seashell 8647 one, that is a load of nonsense. I don't think he can be prosecuted for that. I would say he has a First Amendment right to say it. It was vague. It was ambiguous. I may not say something pleasant about the man's psychology, but I don't think it's a criminally actionable threat.
First of all, there's nobody asking questions, and it's Question Friday. That's the first thing.
Well,
Second,
I'm being so boring and leaving.
no, you're not. No, they're being a very obstreperous audience today. And Robert Nasser points out that there's 4 people that have not hit the like button. And I kept the volume on my phone when I turned to look, so I'm hearing what I just said. I'm actually getting 7 that have not hit the like button. I'm going to need you to hit the like button, folks. It's an absolute necessity. I just saw breaking news on the phone. Obviously, we can't get into it because I haven't read the story, but it said that right-wing Republicans have blocked Trump's agenda on something. So that'll be something to look forward to going forward.
I like to see that. I like to see some spine and some resistance.
You know what the craziest thing ever is when you actually have guys that are conservatives, guys that I would disagree with on a lot, but they nonetheless are what we would think traditional conservatives, and they go against Trump, and then they're called rhinos because Republican in name only simply means now going against Trump.
Right.
Okay, so Bonnie Bertrand says, any thoughts on Trump's Middle East trip? First of all, I think that the idea that he's going to take a plane from Qatar is ridiculously disgusting. I think it violates the Emoluments Clause of the United States Constitution. His argument that it's a gift to the United States, but it's going to go in his presidential library seems a little absurd to me. So that's the first thing. It seems to me, and this is speculation on my part, so just take it with a grain of salt. But I do know Trump's psychology. I know what kind of human being he is, and it seems like he's trying to stick it to Netanyahu. I don't know, like I said, it's speculation. I'm not going to bet the farm on this. It just seems that way because he's talking about a Palestinian state, and he's talking about taking off the what's the word I'm looking for, Jim? Sanctions on Syria. So, negotiating with the Houthis, negotiating with Iran. So it just seems like that might be the case. I'm not a big fan of kissing up to terrorists either, or even, former terrorists, but seems that he might be doing that. And then this deal he made with Qatar about them buying Boeing planes, I think is way beyond the scope of what the president should be doing. So, Jim, well, what do you think about his Middle East trip? And friend Harper, I'm going to get your question next time because you said that your last question was not answered. I don't know what it was, and you don't either, so we can't answer that, but I will answer this one. But, Jim, you first. Trump's Middle East trip.
Well, it really reveals a lot about Trump, something I've already, inferred from Trump's behavior logically. He doesn't know what freedom is all about. He doesn't appreciate the superiority of the American system. So he goes there, and I think perhaps the most irritating part of his comments in the Middle East was that we're not going to tell you how to live. We're not going to criticize you. You're beautiful, wonderful people. What tall, handsome, and it did happen to be intelligent guys you are. So here he is heaping praise on monarchs, on monarchies, on theocratic monarchies. He is not criticizing the culture or the government, the forms of government that are there. So his view of things is that America, and I mean, as a general proposition, I wouldn't go after every government in the world that opposed us, but I would be very clear about what we're in favor of and what we're not. See, Trump wouldn't know a dictatorship if it bit him in the ass. And more than that, he evades the difference. These people can be just swell. These people can be good people. This whole system that they have over here. And it's hands off, hands off, hands off. And I would never criticize you guys for your theocratic backwards ways. That's what disturbs me actually the most. No, I don't think we should open diplomatic relations with Syria yet until they've proven what kind of government they're going to have, since they're led right now by a former Al-Qaeda terrorist.
Yeah, but Al-Qaeda is so yesterday, Jim. You got to get with the times.
So 20 years ago. Yeah, but the truth is that Qatar, Iran, negotiating with them, now Qatar may be on a spectrum, maybe better than Iran, but they're they harbor Hamas. They're not a free country. None of these countries that he's praising are free countries. He wants the glorious feather in his cap of bringing peace between Israel and all the Arab Muslim states. And, Abraham Accords 2.0. And he'll never get a Nobel Peace Prize, but he's aiming for that reputation of being a peace lover. And for doing that, and to do that, he is willing to suck up and praise people whose forms of government are immoral, dictators, theocrats, in the name of no multiculturalist, moral relativist could have stated it better than Donald Trump did. It's really revealing that the left has actually been positive, more positive about this than they have been about anything about Trump lately, because it reveals their multiculturalism, their cultural relativism, that this moral sanction of a savage culture is what Trump is out there doing, and that is the most destructive thing of all.
I hate that, Jim. I hate that the word sanction means both to approve of and punish.
Yes, yes. It's a funny thing. They can mean, we were talking about the principle of two definitions. This does not come under that. One means the exact opposite of the other use of the very same term.
All right. So friend Harper asked a question that's going to be difficult for me to answer and maybe difficult for Jim. I don't know. But he says, any thoughts on education? I've heard it sucked for a long time. Is it getting any better, even via private orgs? The problem for me is I don't have children, and it's been quite some time since I've been out of school. And when I was in school, I wasn't paying attention anyway. So I don't know. I've heard the same thing. And if you look at like comparisons where we've fallen in terms of math, science, reading, that sort of thing, it would indicate we do have a serious problem with education. The only real position that I have on education is that we need to get the government out of education. Other than that, I have no real instructions for how people ought to be teaching kids. Montessori seems like a very good system. I interviewed Catherine Dickinson. I don't remember the system that she teaches, but it seemed to have a lot of promise as well. But that's about the end of my knowledge on the subject. Jim, what say you?
Yeah, like everything the government takes control over, because we need it so badly, whether it's healthcare or education. And you notice healthcare and education, that's where the costs have soared higher, many times higher than regular inflation, because the government is subsidizing it. Government takes over and monopolizes it, and suddenly there's all kinds of compliance regulations. There's all kinds of rules you have to obey. And of course, it's a public thing. So if there is no competition, if there is and the less parental control there is, the worse it is. So leaving aside the constitutional question, just as with anything else, I would say government, get the hell out of it, unless it's the police, the army, the courts, something that the government ought to be doing. And education is absolutely something the government morally, again, forget the constitutional issues, morally the government should not be indoctrinating, propagandizing our kids. And that is the inherent nature of education. So more than that, any business the government tries to take control over, it destroys. It destroys. It drives up the costs. It reduces availability, drives down quality. And education has declined in my lifetime. And the funny thing is, when I was a kid, I could hear from my parents and grandparents, boy, education has been sliding for some time. But in the last 40 or 50 years, government, the more we spend per child from the government, the worse the outcomes in terms of literacy. And so, especially when it comes to certain big city education, Chicago, Baltimore, my God, they're literally pumping out illiterates just to push them through and get the government money. And the teachers' unions, now to get this, government employee unions are just wrong the teachers union is really a great example, because it shows how the government employee unions have an interest against the taxpayer. They're hostile to good outcomes. They're hostile to parental control. Of course they are. When you have a government union, it's going to be against the interests of the taxpayer. And in this case, it adds the dimension of political indoctrination, philosophical indoctrination. Right. So these teachers unions are fully corrupt. All they want is kids to be forced into these government schools, which are dramatically failing. Anyone who thinks that we don't need radical educational reform in this country really has it out for our kids. Our public education system has dramatically failed our kids. And so I think of all, if I could think of a single issue that if I could wave my magic wand, I'd get rid of public education altogether.
You know, Jim, the unions that you're talking about, I mean, obviously I spent a lot of time around unions while I'm incarcerated, and it's not good. When people understand they have virtually absolute job security, it's not a good thing. And you said that there's a conflict between the teachers and the children based on the unions, because the unions are going to keep the least qualified employed. Now, if you have a completely private system, the conflict goes away because now there's a harmony of interest between the children and the best teachers, right?
And that's exactly it. We put them in conflict. Take COVID. You know, COVID did not kill children.
And yet the teachers' unions wanted to stay
wanted to keep them closed, and oh boy, no, and we need more money, and we need this, that. So all of their demands were absolutely absurd, hurt children. The teachers' unions were killing kids. They were destroying their development, destroying their educational development, destroying their psychological development, keeping the kids out of school. That was their interest to do that during COVID. Nothing could have, and we had increased juvenile suicide, increased juvenile depression. So teachers' unions are perfectly happy to see large groups of children suffer in their education, suffer psychologically for what? So that they could get more perks for their union, in effect, and stay off the job, a little longer, and keep the schools closed. That is a classic example of how government unions and the people they're supposed to serve have contradictory interests, and nothing in recent history could show that better than the way teachers' unions handled the COVID lockdowns. Truly evil. But these public schools are truly evil, and there's no way you can avoid ideological indoctrination in schools. No way. But of course, because the First Amendment's establishment and free exercise clauses, as I've explained before, run afoul of public education as such. But the Supreme Court has always come into with the axiom, well, they got to be able to do public education, so let's just keep it secular. So, it starts out with the school bus cases. Well, sure, if you're just driving kids to school, it doesn't matter which school, as long as you're indiscriminate about which school. Government can subsidize school buses to get kids. When it comes to textbooks and teacher salaries, no, that can't be a direct subsidy to private schools. But then when it comes to tax credits, the Supreme Court has said, and especially recently, that, vouchers, so long as the voucher is, the parent controls where the money goes. But I don't see the distinction between a direct subsidy and a tax voucher. But of course, the Supreme Court has to make these hair-splitting, ridiculous decisions that are all over the map, precisely because they're assuming public education is not a violation of the Establishment Clause, which it clearly is. So my prediction is the Supreme Court will be on the side of the vouchers and school choice, if you will, because that's the direction this court particularly is heading in. But it doesn't alter the fact that government schools are just wrong. Religious parents who can't afford to send their kids to private schools are forced to send them to public schools. I am an atheist. I believe in science. I want my kids to be taught real science and evolution. But is it a violation of the religious parents' rights to have their kids not be taught what they want or the priorities they want? Or to
and then parents conflict with other parents. So in a KR asks, if we only have private schools, how to prevent Qatari companies, etc. involvement? Well, first of all, we have public schools now when we're not preventing their involvement, right? So we have that. But
they're subsidizing our universities too.
Yes,
a little bit.
But you could also make laws against that. I don't think I would favor it, but you could. I mean, it would be better than what we have now. But ultimately, in my view, and of course, it's not a guarantee because there's no guarantees in life, and it doesn't matter what type of school you have or what type of anything you have. But in a free society with free education, the schools are likely to be more transparent in who's funding them and where their money's coming from and what they're going to be teaching, because they're competing for your money. They want to put out the best product. They want people to understand that they have the best product and what they're offering. And, you know, if you have a school that's not going to tell you who's funding them, i.e. Qatar, then I'm not sending my kids there. And I think that schools would get that. Could you stop it entirely? No. But even if you pass laws against it, you're not going to stop it entirely. I mean, we have laws against murder, but yet people get killed. So I think that the best way to go is the free route. Jim, what say you on this?
Absolutely, the free route. Currently, if a school accepts private money, and that's the only charter school, you know, say foreign money of any kind, and that's the only school that's available, you know, your choices are limited. If there was a separation of state and education, as there ought to be, because there's a separation of church and state, and for the same reason, then what you do is you give the power to the parents. The parents would be able to go in and ask, well, who are you getting your money from? Well, we refuse to tell you. Well, I refuse to send my kid there. You know, that sort of thing. But it would be more important, rather than where the money is coming from, what the kids are being taught. And it's up to the parents in any context to monitor, control, to understand what their kids are being taught, and to make the appropriate educational decisions as to where to send their kids. So my fear is not so much where the money necessarily might come from, but what's being taught. And on that score, we'd have a lot more control. In other words, on the university level, it's really clear. Pro-Islamic propaganda is being taught at our universities. And yes, they're getting money from Qatar and all kinds of other Iran, all kinds of other Middle Eastern countries. But we don't have control over that. Why? Because we have government subsidized universities. And if you don't, you know, if you're like Hillsdale and you opt out of the government system, you know, Hillsdale is the place you're least likely to get Islamic propaganda, isn't it? It's at these government subsidized schools that also receive foreign money that they have this propaganda. So parents, wake up to what your kids are being taught, and there's no substitute for that. It won't be the fault of some foreign government putting money into a school. It'll be the fault of the parents. And it would seem to me that most parents in this country would be on that. You know, like a June bug on whatever the old saying goes. So that's the big protection. Currently, with public schools, we don't have that. Currently, in our public schools, the teachers could be subjecting your kid to anti-Israel propaganda, even if they're not subsidized by Qatar. So with or without the subsidy, the content, which is the main worry, of course, I think that would be behind the questioner. Guess what? You have no control when it's public school, and that's the only school you can afford to send your kids to. And guess what? They can still have the propaganda there. I want a system where the parents have more control. Let me suggest, if you have that, you'll have less Islamist propaganda.
Now, Kat Sterling, and I'll tell you in a second. She says, should there be a basic standard of education in schools, though, to make sure children are reaching basic milestones as far as reading, writing, math go? Now, I looked ahead in the comments, and Robert Naser says that I previously advocated to have a minimum standard. So I guess I've changed my mind, because it's not to say that I would ultimately just be adamantly opposed to there being a minimum standard. The problem I have with saying, when she asks, should there be a basic minimum standard? Okay, who's going to set it? And then we get right back to the same problem, because now the government is going to step in, because there's nobody else that can enforce it anyways. So the government sets out their basic minimum standard. What is it? You know, are they going to steer parents to the schools that they want their kids to go to, say you have to reach these criteria, and that happens to be just what's being taught in public schools today? So I'm not adamantly opposed to it, but if I previously said that I was for a minimum standard, I've changed my mind. I don't know why, because I don't even remember thinking about it, but I've changed my mind nevertheless.
Everything that makes public education wrong and a violation of the Establishment Clause makes setting educational standards and minimums wrong. Once you allow the government that foot in the door, where they get to decide on the content, of what's being taught, you're heading down a slippery slope of government-endorsed ideology, which is, in my view, inconsistent with the Establishment Clause. To give you some very basic examples, I oppose, when it comes to basic teaching of math and reading, I oppose new math. Philosophically, I oppose the look-say method and I am in favor of the phonics method of teaching reading. So what are we going to have? There's this basic government minimum standards. So government is going to be making educational, philosophical, really, developmental, psychological, developmental, or pedagogical decisions, which are rooted in philosophy. I am opposed to government setting standards in education in general. Now, at some basic minimum level, wouldn't you say, well, you're abusing the child in some way? I would draw a big distinction between the physical abuse of a child and the physical harm of a child and their mental development. That I do not trust government when it comes to the mental development, regulating or monitoring the mental development of children in general.
So you made a great point, Jim, that the monitoring thing, right? Because Sam Cox asked, I think, a great question. He says, should kids be required to attend school, to be educated, starting and ending at what ages? And as I'm processing his question and I'm listening to you, what I'm thinking is, well, you can't abuse kids. Like if you just locked them in a room and didn't let them read, that would be abuse. But at the same time, what is the alternative is to have the government monitoring them. And then we have the same problem is the government is making these decisions. And it just seems to me, right, that if you've got parents that are having kids that are not going to educate them, you've got bigger problems on your hands than just the education piece, right? So I have to say, as scary, and it does scare me, the idea of there not being any requirement to send kids to school scares me. I think the alternative of compelling parents to do it scares me more.
Oh, yeah.
And again, there's no such thing as perfection. We're not going to get it, especially not through the legal system. So I'm going to say, and it doesn't mean I won't change my mind, on the subject, but I'm going to say, no, I don't think that there should be laws requiring parents to send their kids to school.
Your law doesn't guarantee. The current situation
right.
demonstrates that the law doesn't produce even literate graduates. No, and one of the big factors in the quality of the kids' educational experience is parental involvement. If the parents are not involved, what did you learn today in school, Johnny? Are you doing your homework? What kind of homework? What did the teacher tell you today? Parental involvement is directly related, maybe more than any other factor, to the educational outcomes of the kids. So whatever public compulsory laws you have, whatever public education you provide, it is no substitute for parental involvement in education, which is a sine qua non of good educational outcomes. If you admire your parents, or if your parents are saying, oh, good job, you did good in that class, if your parents are giving you the right incentives, involved in your education, showing up like my mom did to every single PTA meeting, that will have a direct impact, and a bigger impact, frankly, than probably the school you said, whether it's a Montessori school or not a Montessori school. It's parental interest in the kids. If there is no parental interest in the kids, now what does public education do? It totally just disconnects that parental interest. No, we're in charge. Don't worry. You don't need to worry about this. We're educating your kids. So we're turning a whole bunch of parents into these zombies who don't take parental responsibility. Why? Because public education gives them an excuse. It's like giving the good housekeeping seal of approval to certain schools or public schools so that the parent can think, oh, I can treat this like basically a subsidized babysitting
Jim, we have serious dissension in the ranks here. We've got a serious person with a serious objection. And this is Robert Naser. And
he's a serious person.
He is, and he's a great guy too, by the way.
He
very,
is.
very nice guy. I've told him before, I'll say it again. As far as living what I guess, for lack of a better word, would be the spirit of objectivism in terms of sense of life, I don't know if there's anyone better than Robert, from what I know of him. I mean, I'm obviously limited, but from what I know of him, from interacting with him online and seeing him talk, just a great guy. So I hate to have to disagree with him, but I'm afraid I have to. Robert says, damn, you're making me take the devil's advocate position. No, the law won't stop all instances of neglect, just as laws against murder won't stop all murders, but that's not an argument. The problem is murder is a clear violation of somebody's rights. It's an overt attack on somebody's existence. Even an assault is the same thing, or the theft is. In the case of education, you're actually flipping it and you're threatening parents. You must educate the kids. So now the government is actually taking the role of initiating force instead of protecting against it. And the point here is, yes, murder is so serious, you outlaw it because you're hoping to prevent some murders. And yes, you're not going to prevent all of them, but then when somebody commits the murder, you remove them. If you have the situation where you have a parent and you don't like the way that they're educating their kids, then what are you going to do? You're going to remove that kid and put them where? I mean, our system of foster parenting and orphanages, they haven't exactly done fantastically either.
Foster care system is
So I get that. I get the fear and the idea that you can't have parents neglecting kids. I just think, one, I don't think it's a serious problem. I don't think it's rising to a serious level where parents are just not going to educate their children. That's the first thing. And for those that aren't going to, they're not doing well now anyways. But the idea that the government, because now if you say they have to educate, well, now you have to set the standard. The government has to set the standard. Then the government has to make sure the schools are implementing the standard. Then the government has to check if the kids are actually reaching the standard. And you just end up right back where we are. And I just don't think that's a good idea. Jim, do you want to take on Robert? Go ahead, because I got to hit mute and cough.
Okay, I love Robert Naser. He is one of my favorite people in this whole wide world. But I disagree with I love Leonard Peikoff. He's one of my favorite people in the whole wide world too. And occasionally I have to disagree with Dr. Peikoff, and I guess I have to disagree sometimes with Robert Naser. But guess what? We each have our own contexts. And look, we have government schools, and those government schools, in terms of the degree to which government is involved, it almost measures the degree to which we have bad outcomes. And as I say, without parental involvement, see, private schools are doing better. And one of the reasons I will concede is that these are the parents who have the most interest in their kids' education. And so they say, I'm not going to send them to that school that's pumping out illiterates. I'm going to send them to a school where they're actually going to learn something. But there's no government rule that can do that. There's no government law that can mandate that. And if you force them to send them, as you point out, force them to have some kind of minimum standards, then what you're doing is you're having the government making philosophical decisions about what proper education is and what proper education isn't. And I do not trust the government in that role. You open the door that little bit. You let the camel's nose under the tent just a little bit to say, government, you decide the educational standards that are appropriate. And it's an engraved invitation to government abuse. And I think also a violation of the Establishment Clause. When it comes to the content of the mind, I think it would be enormously dangerous to allow the government to have any role. Do I think it's horrifically immoral? I'll draw an analogy that I think Robert might be able to understand. I think it's immoral if a woman knowingly lets her pregnancy go to late term before getting an abortion. My position on the legality of abortion is different than my view of the morality of certain abortion situations. And the same here. I think a parent is a rotten parent. And I think social pressure on the parent is the only answer to this, because there is no substitute at the end of the day for parental interest having a meaningful impact on the child's educational outcomes. And so while I think it's grossly immoral for a parent not to educate their child, I would sanction, ridicule, criticize those parents who don't educate their kids. But I don't think that's going to be a big issue. I think the vast majority. I think the problem isn't that parents don't want their kids to have education. They do. They just want to be able to control what their kids are being taught. I think that is a right on the part of the parents. And I think the government has no role in the indoctrination of children.
Okay, Jim, it's about time for me to give my capitalist thought of the day. So before that, tell everybody where they can find you.
Well, I'm on Facebook nearly every day answering questions. Please hit me up there, James Stevens Valliant. And, for some crazy reason, this guy here, Michael Liebowitz, he'll have me on his Rational Egoist podcast. He'll have me on this podcast. And so, fortunately, Michael Liebowitz is here, and he provides this amazing set of platforms for me. I'm the author of 2 books. You can check out the one, www.creatingchrist.com.
And you got to get the other one back in print, Jim, by the way.
Yeah, the wheels are in motion on that.
Okay, so Robert actually preempted my capitalist thought of the day. Great minds think alike. So Robert says there's parallel with the argument against anarchy, but it takes more than a chat comment to lay it out. Bottom line, no education should not be state run, but child abuse, including neglect. And that includes failing to teach a child the basic language is not the answer. So let me give my capitalist thought of the day in reference to anarcho-capitalism. Because what I was thinking is, with all the critiques that I level against government, people might think, why not just be an ANCAP? And the truth of the matter is, I flirted with it. I have more than once. I mean, I came to the conclusion it was unworkable. And then I watched what government does. And I said, well, what the hell? This isn't working. Right. But the problem is, and the reason I'm not an ANCAP is because I do not think it's possible to have a capitalist individual rights respecting society without a central body that governs, without a final arbiter that writes the laws, interprets them, and enforces them. I think we have to have that. I'm not optimistic that such an organization is ever going to come about and do the things that I want it to do, because thousands of years of history would seem to illustrate that it won't. However, human beings are free, have free will, so past is not necessarily prologue. And I think the key is philosophy. And if enough people come to accept a philosophy of reason, a philosophy of individual rights, I think a minimal or a restrained or limited or minarchist, whatever you want to call it, government can work. I do not think an anarchist system can work. And with that, Jim, I have you back over and over because you're brilliant. You can do whatever you want. You are the great Jim Valliant.
Abraham Lincoln was raised by illiterates in the Kentucky frontier and then Southern Illinois frontier. He taught himself to read by candlelight with minimal help from someone who wasn't involved in any educational system. There have been many people who've been functional illiterates who went on to have great careers and even become classically educated. The parents are not the deciding factor. Now, it may take a heroic person, in entertainment. There's Danny Kaye, musical star, huge movie star of yore. He could not read. He had no musical training, and he turned out to be the guy he is. So the content of education, it's not a deterministic creator of the outcome, even the educational outcome, even a rotten parent, which I think would be extremely, extremely rare. But the point is that the government exists for one function: to ensure that all human interaction is voluntary, to prevent coercion, to protect physical force. And I cannot justify content regulation of education on that grounds.
Jim, you are awesome. Thank you very much. And audience, thank you very much for joining us. I'll be back here Monday, same bad time, same bad channel. Remember, 1, hit like. 2, check out the Rational Egoist podcast. And 3, go to AmericanCapitalistParty.org. Other than that, I'll see you Monday.
Be well.